Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here, as promised, with a brand new season of Total War Warhammer 2 faction tier lists. Now, for those of you who did not experience the prior wave, in this series we simply examine a specific faction's units, their lords, regiments of renown, their characters, and discuss, well, where exactly they fall and usefulness for a faction. Are they excellent in all matchups? Are they a must-pick? If you're picking that unit, is it something you always see? Are they decisive in a handful of matchups? Or is it perhaps a total lemon that you're better off just bringing literally anything else on the roster than that unit? Well, it all depends, and in this series we are going to be discussing that and seeing where exactly all the units on a specific roster may lie. And in this case, of course, we are covering the Glorious Empire. Of course, if a unit or lord or character is not where you believe they should be, well, then unfortunately, you're wrong, because my word is law, and my opinion is objective truth. No, just kidding, guys. You know how this works. If you disagree, or if you feel I'm missing something about a specific unit, character, whatever it may be, obviously, post down in the comments below. Let me know what you think. I'm always looking forward to your guys' responses and talking about all the different units and uses, because a lot of times I learn something new. I find out that a unit that I previously thought is not very good is actually really strong somewhere, or might have some use cases that I just didn't think of. And that's the beauty of this game. There's a lot of ways to play. There's a lot of ways you can utilize different units and characters and all of that. So without further ado, we are diving into Empire, and we are kicking things off with the head honcho, of course, Karl Franz. And this bad boy is an excellent lord. However, he's not going to get an S tier. I'm sure this is going to immediately be a little bit controversial, but he's going to get an A tier. And the reason for that is because while Karl Franz is strong lord and probably the strongest, a little debatable, but probably arguably the strongest lord on the Empire roster, he has a lot of stiff competition. There are a lot of very potent Empire lords, and while they may not be as generally useful as Karl, they are powerful enough to where Karl is not necessarily the best lord pick in the majority of matchups. In my personal opinion, I think Karl does have a few very powerful matchups. I think, for example, against Bretonnia, he is a very strong pick. I think he's solid against vampire counts, decent against high elves. He certainly has these use cases. At the same time, I think there's a lot of matchups where he simply does not perform, or is not necessarily the best option that you have, where you're better off bringing Boris, Volkmar, Balthazar Gelt, or any of the other Empire Lord choices. And as such, he's going to get himself an A tier. He is an excellent buff bot with his Reichland Runefang and stand your ground and hold the line. He can really support a Demigryph blob. He's an excellent sniper with his high charge bonus on good old Deathclaw, especially stacked on top of the Gal Miraz buff that improves his damage bonus versus large, as well as giving him extra AP damage. Karl Franz is going to be an absolute nightmare to deal with. He can snipe out characters rather effectively while simultaneously buffing his forces. However, this does limit his synergy a bit. He is fairly expensive. You basically have to bring him with the Lore of Life caster because he has 0 self-sustain, and he's not really that effective at supporting a wide army. He's not really that effective at supporting, say, a missile line or supporting a very wide mid-tier cavalry build, because he simply cannot be everywhere at once, and his buffs are limited to an AoE around him. And of course, because he has to have a self-sustained caster, Lore of Life isn't the most flexible lore. It's a lore that can support a handful of elites well, but trying to support a very wide army with Lore of Life is, in my opinion, rather difficult. And thus, good old Karl here is going to have himself an A tier. I think a very respectable start, but not an S as some might have expected. Next up, Balthazar Gelt, one of the OG starting lords, and unlike many, I think Balthazar is actually a really good lord choice for Empire. I think he's very solid. However, when it comes to dull and duller, Balthazar definitely fits that bill as well. He's an incredibly uninspired character when it comes to design. Essentially, he gets 2 arcane conduits with the Staff of Volans as well as an arcane conduit, and besides that, he's a Lore of Metal caster tossed up on a Pegasus. Kind of uninspiring, it's kind of lazy and boring, especially when compared to more modern Total War Warhammer lore. Is definitely a relic of Warhammer 1 days. However, he is very good at supporting especially wide Empire builds. His Plague of Rust allows you to utilize mid-tier Empire Cav against armored targets, which traditionally Reichsguard Knights of the Blazing Sun simply do not perform well against heavily armored targets. It allows you to utilize Huntsman, Crossbows, archers, pistoliers, those sorts of units to just delete enemy targets very, very quickly. Can make your grenade launchers perform much better against a more heavily armored infantry unit. Of course, the final transmutation is the ultimate blob buster. If you're playing against Skaven, for example, you can just eradicate a hero blob with final transmutation. The lords and heroes tend to have low HP. They tend to melt rather quickly to that. He himself is very cheap, which allows you to bring a very wide army. You don't have to bring a caster. And he's fairly hard to kill. He's pretty quick. Obviously, on Quicksilver, he's almost uncatchable for the majority of enemies. Obviously, not something you want to bring in, say, High Elves or Wood Elves, where you can see Waystalker Snipes or Tempests smacking you down. But against factions such as Lizardmen, where his Plague of Rust comes into play, against factions like Dwarves, where you can make your non-AP troops perform much better against heavily armored Dwarven infantry. Against Chaos, he can make your troops much more effective against their handful of heavily armored targets. Against Skaven, he can bust up a blob and allow you to go with a very wide non-AP formation, while simultaneously having some counters to more heavily armored targets. If your opponent happens to bring, say, Doom Wheels or Doom Flayers, he can debuff their armor and allow, say, Knights of the Blazing Sun to manhandle them, which they traditionally would struggle with. So for that, Balthazar is going to get a B tier. He's not as much of a hard carry lord. You really have to play a bit more micro-intensive strategy. He's not as forgiving. He is, as mentioned, a bit dull and uninspired. So he's going to get a B tier. He certainly will not hard carry you at late game. If this is all you got left of your army, obviously he's a much cheaper lord than than say Karl Franz, but he's not a fighter. He's not going to be a win condition for your army, where if your opponent ignores him the whole game, he will single-handedly win you the fight with terror at the end. But he is still a very, very strong lord, and I think deserves an easy B tier for that. Volkmar is another one who I'm sure will draw some controversy when I drop him at A. And that is, well, because Volkmar is kind of an inflexible pick. He is a popular pick, I know, and he has some incredibly powerful matchups. Factions such as High Elves, in particular, struggle to shut him down effectively. He can do reasonably well against factions like Vampire Counts, where his magic damage is very potent. He can do reasonably well against Vampire Coast. His mix of magic and fire damage really makes him solid at clearing out ethereal units. His insane combat buffs make him a great support tool for a Demigriff blob, or you can even meme around and bring steam tanks and units like that, but really the Demi blob is where you see this guy the most. However, he is an absolute terrible character fighter. He has very poor combat stats and incredibly poor weapon strength. Even with all his buffs from Hammer of Sigmar, that sort of thing, he just does not perform very well against single targets or even cavalry. If you don't have Soulfire off cooldown, he's not going to do very much to cavalry. A unit like Blood Knights or even something cheaper will beat the crap out of him. He does have the benefit of high magic resist on the War Altar of Sigmar, and that does, of course, allow him to tank through some niche units. Like Grail Knights, for example, won't do very much. It's one of the reasons he's very potent against High Elves, because he's basically immune to Phoenixes trying to snipe him. He's basically immune to Sisters of Avalorn trying to mow him down, that sort of thing, because he just has magic and missile resist there. It adds up very, very nicely. And due to the combination of having regen, terror, being unbreakable, he is absolutely a win condition. He can perform very well in late game situations where you just got a handful of lower end troops, especially if you snipe the Lord. He can really just carry the day. That said, once again, Volkmar cannot really fight enemy characters. He's kind of limited in his usage. He can only really support that elite core. He's not something I think that you want with a very wide build, because he can't be everywhere at once. He can't be buffing everything at once. And in the meantime, your entire army can collapse. For example, I see him used often against Beastmen, which I think is a grave mistake. He cannot support all your flanks. You lose 3/4 of the battle. You happen to win the one pocket that Volkmar's in, and then you lost the entire game because, well, Volkmar can't be everywhere at once. So that is why Volkmar is going to land himself an A. I think he's very powerful. He's definitely better than, say, Balthazar Gelt. I think he's got more use cases there, especially with how domineering he is against a faction like High Elves. But he's absolutely not someone you're going to bring in every matchup. It's not really someone you want against, say, Dwarves, or in my opinion, it's Wood Elves. I know some people like him against Wood Elves. I'm not a huge fan of that. Not someone you want, I think, against a faction like Dark Elves or Lizardmen, factions like that. He just doesn't quite perform up to snuff there, but I think that he does have his use cases and can be very powerful when utilized correctly. Then, moving on to another legendary lord, and in fact the third A tier, and I think probably the most controversial choice for an A tier here, and that is going to be Boris Todbringer. And Boris, I'm sure some people would like if I would place him down at B tier. They think Karl and Volkmar are better, but I think Boris is just a stable, reliable pick. While he might not be a domineering choice in any one matchup, though I do think he's probably the best choice you have against, say, Wood Elves, then I do think he is never a bad pick. Boris is always a competitive choice. You can bring him in a variety of forms. The fact that he self-medicates, that he heals, is excellent. It means you can bring a wide variety of caster characters. He does have enough oomph and punch to be a bit of a sniper, even though not up to snuff with Carl. He has a multitude of small AoE buffs with Hold the Line, but more importantly, small AoE debuffs with Crush the Weak and the White Cloak of Ulrich, which allows him to really support blob fights a bit and fight well in a protracted engagement because he's constantly debuffing enemy performance. And of course, he's constantly healing. So throughout the fight, if your opponent can't snipe Boris out, he can always come back stronger than ever and clobber you later in the game. And while he doesn't necessarily have hard carry matchups, as I mentioned, he can always perform well. And you don't necessarily have to bring him on a Griffin. For example, against Wood Elves, I like to bring Boris on a Pegasus. It makes him very difficult to snipe. He can still outfight the majority of Wood Elf characters in 1v1. And he's incredibly mobile and just serves his function. If they do try to snipe him, if they happen to net you, shoot you with some Weight Watchers, he heals through it and he survives. And similar case in a handful of other matchups. I think the only matchup where I maybe don't feel like he's a decent choice is Dwarves. Though even there, I think on a Griffin, he can be one of your stronger choices. Dwarves are just a difficult matchup for Empire in general. But I think there's a use case for just about every Empire Lord there, even though none of them are necessarily perfect. I take that back. Boris is solid against Dwarves. The regen and Griffin definitely help. Unfortunately, Hold the Line Crush the Weak did take a hit to the leadership debuff. It's not there's no longer a synergy with Blood Roar. You used to do -4 leadership. Now you just got Blood Roar on Boris, which removed the old combo with the Amber Wizard. And so unfortunately, Boris lost that little bit of a Terror Bomb gimmick, but besides that, I think he's still just a solid Lord choice. He's always a stable Lord choice, even if not always the best. Moving on to a good old Hunts Marshal Marcus Wolfhard. I'm going to give him a solid B. And that's because I think he's a niche pick. And there are matchups people enjoy him in that I don't necessarily think he's good in. There's matchups where I enjoy him in where some people probably wouldn't recommend him. But all in all, he does have some solid tricks up his sleeve, and he can perform rather well. Focus Shot at the moment is a pretty garbage skill. It's something you don't really want to bring, but Amber Bow does give him some decent ranged burst damage. He can apply constant sustained pressure, of course, with his auto attacks. He's rather solid at just dishing out AP anti-large damage. He can chip down a dragon. He can chip down a single character, whatever the case may be. And of course, he does have a net. So if you're going with a very wide archery heavy or artillery heavy build, he can help provide some defense for your backline on top of whatever cavalry and such that you may have brought. In a way, a better defensive character than a lot of your big monstrous lords because he has a net that hits an AoE rather than simply body blocking one unit for a couple seconds before your opponent force bats past them. That said, he is incredibly flimsy. Magic missiles, Spirit Leech, Waystalkers especially just put you in the dirt in seconds. It's actually terrifying. I see some people who really like this guy against Wood Elves. In my opinion, he's incredibly risky there because Waystalkers and Glades and units like that will just annihilate Marcus. He just doesn't last at all against that sort of accurate focused fire. And of course, he is limited in mobility. You can't give him a mount, and that means that he's kind of bogged down playing around static or very slow kite-oriented builds rather than being a character who you can play more aggressively with more traditional cav-heavy Empire compositions. Moving on to the Archlector. Now, this guy is, I think, a solid choice. And if you're bringing Volkmar on anything but his Volkswagen, this guy's basically him, but better, in my opinion. Granted, he doesn't have the self-heal that Volkmar provides, but he does have all the same buffs that Volkmar has. No bound banishment, of course, but Volkmar doesn't get that off the War Altar either. So he's actually going to net himself a B tier. A little bit of an awkward pick, I think. Probably a low B, maybe a high C. Maybe I'll give him a C. But low B, high C. He's basically a budget version of Volkmar or Karl. If you want to support a demi-blob, you bring this guy, and it frees up a lot of money for something else. Obviously, at this point, you probably will want to bring the Graphites because you want some source of terror, and this guy ain't it. But he gives you cheap buffs. He can't fight worth a damn. He's a wet noodle, but he's relatively tanky with a solid melee defense and armor. Not much to be said for him. He's basically a budget Volkmar. He doesn't have magic or fire damage, so he doesn't have the niche use against, say, ethereals. But all in all, respectable, cheap Lord option, who, if you're just looking to buff up a blob of demigriffs and you want more money for guns or infantry or whatever the case may be, or an extra unit of cav, maybe, then this guy's the way to go. Moving on to Huntsman General. This guy I'm not very fond of at all. I'd probably put this guy at an F tier. I'm going to be nice here and give him a D tier because he does have that single fire damage wombo combo. Honestly, he probably should be an F tier. There's really almost basically never a real reason, especially if you're trying to be competitive, to bring a Huntsman General. The gimmicky fire damage combo makes your backline way too vulnerable to getting gooned out by enemy cavalry or light disruption units. His damage output is just worse than Marcus Wolfhard's against the targets you're trying to shoot most of the time. He doesn't have a net, and his magic missiles are just unreliable and less damaging than Wolfhard's. And I'm basically giving him a D tier, and it's going to be a very low D. This guy should probably be an F, just because I'm feeling a bit generous here, but really not a very good character at all. And I'd argue he might even be worse than the General, who gets himself a C for Chad. No, just kidding. He sucks too. But this guy's about as bad as the General. They're both kind of crummy characters. I'm going to give both of them a D tier, incredibly low D tier. And it's incredibly generous of me to do so, I think. The reason I'm putting the General at a D is because I've been playing him a lot recently, running Mimi man spam builds with Empire. And when you don't really want a Lord and you just need to fill that slot with anything that has a pulse, then this guy is your go-to. Honestly, I feel that Gelt is often better, but with man spam, you want Lore of Light, in my experience, just to get those buffs to immunity psychology. You want to get the nets down, so you don't really want Lore of Metal. And this guy's a bit tankier than Gelt, so you go a bit cheaper than Gelt, and then bring a cheap Light Mage, and you're set. But honestly, this guy's nothing to write home about. Really, him and the Huntsman General are pretty trash and could use some significant buffage, but they do have this handful of use cases where if you want to go in for something very niche, they can perform okay. Moving on into the hero category, and we're actually kicking things off with some additions that were added relatively recently, and that's, of course, Felix and Gotrek. They're a much more important unit on other rosters. On the Empire roster, they are not half as good, I think, as they are on the for Bretonnia or Dwarves. And that's because Empire's Lord usage tends to be, if it's a static Lord, it's a Lord who's either a joke, like the Huntsman General or the Lord General, or it's a Lord who doesn't really fight in melee, like Marcus Wolfhard. That doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot support a character with Felix. That doesn't necessarily mean Felix has no use cases. But ultimately, you're not usually going to be supporting a Lord. You're really bringing Felix just to heal himself and do some damage to infantry. For that, I'm actually going to put him at a low C tier. I think I'm going to give him a low C because in matchups, specifically against Dwarves, as well as a handful of other matchups, you can occasionally throw this guy in the line. He's cheap-ish. I believe he costs 800 gold baseline, so he's not the most expensive combat unit ever. And he actually will do a decent job against enemy infantry over time. He'll just dish out the hurt, and he heals himself over time, so you don't have to worry about bringing a life caster to support him. Is he an excellent Lord choice or a character choice for Empire? Hell no. I think a lot of the time you're going to get much better value out of a Witch Hunter, out of a caster, of course, or a Warrior Priest. But he does have that little bit of a niche use case, and for that I'm going to give him a low C, high D. Gotrek, kind of a similar case. I think he's really not very strong for Empire. I'm actually going to put him at a high D because he doesn't have the use case that Felix has versus Dwarves. As Empire, you don't really have huge issues with most large. Against Cavalry, you've got Huntsman, you've got guns, you've got more guns, even most guns, Outriders, Witch Hunters, you've got Carl, Demigirfs, Halberds, blah 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 blah. You guys know the spiel here. You have a lot of tools against large. It's not really a problem for Empire. Gotrek can be flung into a handful of builds to deal with large. He can actually be decent against Bretonnia, for example, as a support tool. He can be okay against High Elves, though against High Elves, I think he's a bit goofy, but he can do some hurt against High Elves for sure. Chopping up the occasional Phoenix Guard, chopping down dragons to size. Maybe I'll give him a C. I'll be nice. I'll give him a C. I think he has different use cases. You're not going to run him alongside Felix when you're playing as Empire, but I think against, say, High Elves, he can do all right. He can do all right against Bretonnia. He's got these very small niche cases, but not exactly an excellent hard carry hero. Like for Bretonnia, he's probably an A tier. For Dwarves, he's probably an A tier. Same with Felix, but for Empire, he's probably a C. Empire Captain, this guy is going to get himself a D tier, but I will position him right above the Empire General. this guy's just boring. He has a Hold the Line, which got more expensive, which screws over his cheap fighter support character role. He doesn't fight very well. He doesn't fight well at all, in fact. And yeah, his only real gimmick is that you can throw him on a horse, and he kills weapons teams pretty well. So specifically against Skaven, and sort of against Coast, he has a bit of a niche where you take a dirt cheap captain, you throw him on a horse, and you throw him into an enemy backline. And if they waste their time killing him, good for you. If they don't waste their time killing him, good for you, because he'll kill weapons teams like no tomorrow. He can chop them down to size rather quickly, and it's one of his few good uses. But really, this guy's not worth more than a D tier. A bit disruptive against Wood Elves as well. But once again, it's kind of that throwaway cheap hero that you just throw into the fray. And in a lot of cases, you're just better off bringing a stripped down Warrior Priest than this guy. Which does bring us onto the Warrior Priest, and he is a very stable hero, a very solid hero in my opinion. Gets himself a easy A tier. There's not really any build Empire has where a Warrior Priest is an outright bad choice. How you want to bring him varies, but he can provide you with a cheap benediction. He can provide you with a stacking ward save that stacks with the Grand Shield of Faith. He has the Hammer of Sigmar, of course, which stacks with the Grand Hammer of Sigmar, so extra melee attack. And of course, he has small Soulfire rather than Grand Soulfire, which once again gives you more damage output. So fairly expensive as far as heroes go, but he can provide support for a demi-blob if you didn't bring Lord to support him. For example, if you brought Gelt, but you also brought some demigriffs, you can throw in a Warrior Priest to support him. If you brought Franz, you can bring a Warrior Priest alongside Franz to get Uber buffage. If you brought Volkmar, he can stack with Volkmar. Not necessarily the best with super wide builds because he doesn't really support missiles very well, but against basically any more melee-centric build, he's not a bad choice. And he can provide some stable support there, and I think gets an A tier just for versatility's sake. Witch Hunter, a more decent pick than I think people give him credit for. I'm going to give him a, would it be a high C or a low B? I'm going to give him a high C. He has his niche uses. If you're going for a wide man-spanning build and you want to support some missiles, this guy can do it. Accusation's great for that. He pours out a decent amount of damage over time. I think against, say, vampire counts, he's not bad because he's one of the few units that actually does magic damage on the Empire roster. Your only other options there are the Hammer of the Witches, which is not good, again, and Luminarc, which is also not good against counts. So really, you got the Silver Bullets and you got Volkmar, and those are your only magic options against counts otherwise. And so I do find that the Witch Hunter is pretty useful there. He can debuff enemy characters and make them much more vulnerable to sniping. Makes him okay against greenskins. He can debuff stone trolls, make them easier to shoot down. He can help just pick off enemy characters. Decent, in my opinion, against dwarves. Though obviously the magic damage hurts him there. Usually he has enough damage to kill infantry models regardless of the magic resistance. So if you can get a good shot, he's decent there. So if you use him correctly, he can be okay against dwarves. And I'm trying to think. There's definitely some more small use cases. I think he's okay against Dark Elves. It's one of those wonky matchups where he can work if you do a kiting build, just because he pours on quite a lot of hurt. He's very squishy. He can't really run very fast, and obviously does have issues with line of sight. He just has a very short range, struggles to get shots off. But if you can keep that damage going, against Lizardmen, he's actually decent. Lizardmen tend to stack missile resistance, especially with Slann and Mazdamundi or Croak and that sort of thing, or their gimmicky Regiment for Renown, the Legion of Chaka. He helps undo that a bit, so especially if you're going for a mid-range missile build, the Witch Hunter can do well there. Generic Empire casters, and this does include the Amber Wizard, even though you're seeing him here, are decent. They're not amazing, they're not terrible. Itemization-wise, they get a Power Stone and Blast. Blast can help you Lord Snipe. You've got a good selection of magic. You're only missing, out of the generic lores, you're only missing a metal because that's exclusive to Gelt. However, you don't have crazy winds of magic generation. These guys can't fight worth a damn. They do, however, have a Pegasus mount. You're almost always going to see some sort of Empire caster. I'm going to put them at an A tier. I think that as far as casters go, they're reasonably versatile, have good lore selection, good mount options, though no combat mounts, but good enough mount options. And some okay itemization. Blast can help snipe a little bit, and Power Stone can give you a little bit more winds magic when you need it. Certainly not a top tier caster, But I guess just because of how Empire is built, the only caster lord you have, you kind of have to bring these guys. So they almost get an S tier. I'm going to give it an A just because they're not an amazing caster character. And I guess this is kind of a comparison with other factions. But you are forced to bring this guy, so I guess he's almost an S tier. I don't know. I'm going to give him an A because it's not that good of a caster, but you have to bring him. Then we do have the Amber Wizard on the Griffin, and this is specifically on the Griffin. And this guy is not very good at all. Another low D, honestly bordering on F. He used to have a gimmicky use case with Boris where you bring the two to get -12 leadership in an AoE instead of -8 or -4. He's lost that now that Boris lost his -4, so no more Blood Roar plus Crush the Weak stacking. So yeah, D tier for the Amber Wizard. I don't really think there's any matchup where he's a particularly strong choice. You kind of have to bring him with a Lore of Life caster. I could see him have, he has a handful of, you could bring him with, say, Carl and try to go for a Super Goon squad. But for his price, he's just not worth it, in my opinion. He's just too expensive, too low in leadership, very flimsy. Just gets a very low D tier. It's probably generous to give him a D and not an F, because you're basically never going to use this guy in a serious composition. If you need terror somewhere in your build, you're better off bringing the Altdorf Graphites. Like, even if you're fighting, let's say, Wood Elves, I'd probably bring the Graphites before I brought this guy, and I don't think bringing terror-causing units against Wood Elves is really worth it as Empire to begin with. But if you're going to bring Volkmar or the Graphites, don't bring a friggin' Amber Wizard, because he's just going to get shot to death in 3 seconds flat, or routed off and chased off the field by some Glade Riders. Like, this guy's just really not very good. Probably being too nice, giving him a D tier. We'll just get us on to the infantry section, and we're going to kick things off with Empire Spearmen. And they're going to be an S tier unit. The first S tier unit here, you're basically going to see them at every build. Even against Dwarves, you can just use these guys to pad out your unit, your width. A bit hypocritical, I guess, that I didn't include the wizard for the same reason. But Empire Spears are nice. If you do man spamming builds, the fact that you've got a cheap source of anti-large everywhere is excellent. They'll actually drag lower end cavalry into the muck pretty well because they do have anti-large. They've got charge defense against large. They've got okay leadership at 60. And they just churn out a decent amount of damage, and they'll hold okay for what they cost. 325 gold, just not the biggest investment. And I think they do get themselves an S tier. I just think you're always going to use them, or nearly every build's going to use them. Even if you might use some of the other infantry options as the primary source of your core, you'll always have a handful of spears to stiffen things up. Moving on to their Shielded Brethren, these guys are going to get an A tier. I don't think they're excellent in every matchup. I think they're good in most. I think they're probably the second most common Empire State Trooper. But they basically just soak missiles, where normal spears don't soak missiles, but they let you bog down enemy infantry for a while. They let you soak missile fire against, say, Lizardmen or a faction like that. They'll hold a little longer because they have better melee defense against, say, vampire counts. Even though you might not need the missile resist there, they can stall out Mourngulls against Vampire Coast. And so you do see these guys a decent amount. However, they do compete a bit with swordsmen. Swordsmen, because they're so good against enemy spear units, are a solid choice against, say, Wood Elves, against High Elves. They're a decent choice against Vampire Coast, where they can crush zombies pretty effectively. And for that reason, and spearmen aren't really something you're going to bring against dwarves because they're not cheap enough to pad out that line. I think you're better off with the swordsmen for the extra 25 gold. So I'm going to give them an A tier here. They're strong, consistent, but you are going to bring swordsmen in a handful of cases where you wouldn't bring these guys necessarily. And for that, swordsmen are actually going to net themselves a solid B tier. They're a respectable unit. Once again, not as many use cases as the spears, but you can use them to mush high elf spearmen, Eternal Guard. You can use them, and obviously they'll stall dryads for a long time, even just because dryads have such bad stats. Not something you want to bring against the true melee faction, because they'll get dumpstered and they won't hold as long as spears would. They don't have the melee defense to do that. And they're obviously not going to dish out that much damage when they get crushed that quick. But against factions that don't have cheap or efficient frontline troops, these guys can definitely perform rather well. And they'll especially do well against spears. It's just a place where they perform rather well. They'll do relatively well against Skaven factions like that. Halberds, a unit that has moved up quite a bit, I think, in the meta, though don't consider them a top tier unit. I think a low C tier is respectable for these guys. Against Vampire Counts, against Lizardmen, they're an okay unit. You can throw them in. You get that bonus versus large. You get that AP damage. Very vulnerable to missiles, though. Obviously, they're slow as all heck because they're infantry. Leadership is a little better than generic state troops, but they're these guys aren't necessarily the greatest thing ever, but you will see them. You'll throw them into the occasional build. I think they can be okay against Chaos to prop your lineup a little bit. Against Bretonia, they're a bit of a hit or miss. You really do have to peel away the enemy heavy cav if you want, or not the enemy heavy cav, the enemy archer support if you want these guys to perform there. But they can have a use case there, and so they will net themselves a C tier. And C tier is one of those tiers now where really a unit, if it's got a semi-consistent use case or a decent use case, I'm going to put it there. But Halberds aren't necessarily something that's meta, but they do have a handful of matchups where they can perform okay. Flagellants are going to get themselves a C tier as well. I think I'm going to move these guys up to a higher C tier, though. I think I use them about as much as a Witch Hunter. I'll put them around there. Unbreakable, which is nice. It gives you a stable front line. Fairly quick on their feet. They can overwhelm backlines if they do win a section of front line. Passable offensive combat stats. Very poor defensive stats. And with no armor. Some of these guys, despite having shirts, at least, and like some smocks, they have less armor than Witch Elves, who really just wear boot plate, and not even boot plate, it's like a bra. But somehow that provides more defense than these guys, ragged hairdos and shirts. But hashtag elfed. That's the elven bias speaking. Slayers as well. They wear pants, but they don't get armor. But either way, these guys, of course, not very survivable, but they can stall a front line. For quite a while just because they're unbreakable, and if they do win a section of front line, they can harass backlines. They're actually decent against Dwarves just because they can compromise Slayers, and I think they actually almost beat Slayers 1v1 despite costing 300 less, and then they can harass backlines just because they're unbreakable. So until the Dwarves kill every single one, they're going to keep harassing them till Judgment Day. They can do okay, again, they can do okay against Dark Elves if you want to go a bit heavier on the front line. They can be a decent second line unit against, say, Vampire Coast or against Wood Elves if you can protect them against any missile pressure. They'll do well against the squishy chaff troops, but easy C tier for these guys. They're either a decent holding force or a decent clubsome squishy trash force, but definitely have their uses. Great swords, a unit I wish I could get more usage out of. They're going to get themselves a low C tier as well. C tier is getting packed, isn't it, guys? But great swords are a solid anchor for a infantry heavy build. If you go for man spam, these guys are going to be good core against, say, lizardmen. They're a decent choice against dwarves, though obviously dwarves just sucks as a matchup. But bringing a handful of great swords for cleanup is not a bad idea. They can perform an all right job against vampire counts if you're going for man spam once again. Lizardman as mentioned against Saurus. Very good against Tomb Kings in my opinion because they crush Tomb Guard pretty effectively, and then they can move on to the back line or actually damage constructs a bit with their AP, even though it's not amazing. They can be thrown in against High Elves. It's not a common sight, but because they do trade okay against White Lions, and they're somewhat resistant to generic archery, they can do okay there. If you want to build around great swords, I don't think it's ideal. But not a unit you see a huge amount of. Definitely have their uses, especially as a core. But mostly, if you're not going for a lot of infantry, these guys just don't really perform their job, in my opinion. They're not great against most of the infantry Empire faces. They're not great against Berserker units, against trash, because they can't cover everything at once. So you're better off going with something cheaper and with. Sigmar Suns are another S tier. I think there's basically no matchup where these guys are bad, and they're actually good in just about every matchup. Actually, these guys might be good in literally every matchup, and they're unbreakable. They actually have shields, unlike Flagellants. They actually have decent combat stats, unlike Flagellants. They only cost 100 more than Flagellants. Yeah, they're awesome sauce. More HP than Swordsmen. A bit more expensive, I should mention, than Vet 9 Swordsmen, but just an amazing unit that will grind with the best of them for 700 gold and absolute steel. And yeah, this is like the centerpiece of any Empire line, basically. Sure, you might go super cheap and not even bother with Sigmar Suns and be like 700 is too much to spend on a core unit. But if you want any anchor, these guys are your go-to. Way better than Flagellants, way better than Great Swords, way better than Tattersouls for that anchor role. if you bring an anchor, it is these boys right here, not any of those other clowns. And then Tattersouls, yeah, the like complete opposite. Basically an F tier unit. I'm being super generous here, and I'm not giving any unit a full-blown F tier. I don't know. Maybe I should give these guys an F tier because they're really freaking bad. If you want to meme around and run a Unbreakable build or a Crusade build, okay, bring these guys, but they are trash. You're better off bringing 2 Flagellants than 1 Flagellant and Spears. The Tattersouls are just... They're much more expensive Flagellants with just a higher model count, is what they really are. So they suck. But for thematic builds, they're all right. And if you happen to have some money laying around and you want to upgrade something, then okay, you can upgrade some Flagellants to these guys if you're going super heavy on the Unbreakable. But they might actually, I think they're actually the worst just because their use case is so super niche. I might actually give these guys an F tier just because I feel that there isn't really a niche. It's just these weird, forced, absolutely, completely forced situations. You don't even build around these guys. It's just you happen to have some spare cash, I guess. And you don't want to get Foe Seeker or Deadly Onslaught or whatever. I don't know. I wouldn't really run these guys. I think F tier's actually pretty fair. Better to get Flagellants and then some Foe Seeker and Deadly Onslaught probably. Moving on to Empire State Missile Troops. First off, we got Archers, a solid unit, not my cup of tea, but and not a unit I run very often, as you probably noticed on this channel, but a unit that does have its niche. It's dirt cheap. Provides a decent volume of fire, has enough range to outrange most generic skirmishers. And can just provides weight of fire really. And for 350 gold, they're literally the cheapest missile unit in the game. So they can provide a lot of fire for very, very little money. So I'm actually going to give them a respectable upper C tier. Against shorter range factions like Dark Elves, they're absolute murder. They can do okay against Vampire Coast just because you can bring so many of them. An okay unit against Beastmen because they're kind of a throwaway. If you bring Armor Sundering with Gelt, they can do okay against Lizardmen just because, once again, you can bring so many. Against Norska, they can do okay. Once again, sheer volume counts for something. And these guys provide it. Certainly not an amazing unit by any stretch of the imagination, but they have this little bit of a niche and just providing a raw damage output. If you get backlines getting breached and you have, say, a handful of archers plus, say, crossbows and guns, these guys can help provide some point defense with raw, once again, weight of fire. And that's why they get C tier. They're decent for that. Free Company Militia, kind of the big brother of archers. They have pistols, and there's 90 of them, and they can fight. So that makes them a bit better at that defense. They can now fire on the move, decent backline harass unit if you happen to be flanking or surrounding. They pour on even more fire than archers. You just have to be wary about line of sight, but at the same time, they can hit flyers much better than archers can. I think I'll give them a higher C tier, but it's still a C tier unit. Empire missiles just overlap so much and they compete so heavily that I think a lot of them are going to be in a similar spot. But Free Company, I think, is a little more stable than archers. The fact they can defend themselves against, say, hounds does count for something. The fact they can clean up enemy archers counts for something. Being able to fire on the move is very nice. They are a little less effective at counter skirmishing because they've only got 90 versus 120 range. But being able to fire on the move kind of offsets that. They are a little pricier at 450 versus 350. But all in all, I think a little bit better, but fulfilling a similar role of non-AP DPS with a flair of self-defense. That's C tier. Next up, Crossbows. I'm going to rate Crossbows as the lowest of the Empire missiles. I think they're the worst of the bunch, so that still places them at the bottom of C tier. I think they're decent against Dwarves, where you don't need bonus first large from Huntsman. But you do want that extra AP that they get on their missiles. You do want the extra, and you can synergize, say, Gelt to break enemy armor. They can really pour on the fire, and they're cheap. I think they can be a cheap option against Wood Elves, where their range matters, because Archers and Free Company obviously don't have that much range. They can be... I'm trying to think of what other use cases. There's a handful of use cases for these guys. You could try to... The main problem is that they overlap quite a bit with Huntsman, and in most cases, Huntsman I find are superior. They are worth the extra money, just because they do so much better against large. But if you are fighting against, a more infantry-heavy build, so in particular, I would say Dwarves, and to a lesser extent against a faction like they can actually do okay against Lizardmen. If you provide them with some armor sundering from Gelb, they can do all right there. The biggest thing really is that these guys are good against Dwarves, and because that's such a bad matchup for Empire, the mere fact that this unit's pretty respectable there is enough for me to put them up to bottom C tier. Even though they don't have too many other use cases where I prefer them to Huntsman. Wood Elves, though, that range does matter a little bit, and they are cheaper than Huntsman, so it can be very rather helpful to get themselves a C tier there. Moving on to Handguns, an excellent unit, but one that I think has become a bit, not necessarily overshadowed, but definitely has much stiffer competition now with Huntsman. Before, this was kind of the king head honcho of the Empire missile lineup, or at least as foot missiles are concerned. Nowadays, obviously Outrider buffs, or really the rate of fire fix, plus Huntsman's introduction makes these guys less of the premier monster killer in the Empire roster. Still a respectable unit. Excellent against Dwarves, can just pour on the firepower against stunty filth. They can mow down dinosaurs, mow down Tomb Kings. Synergize rather well with Huntsman. You can mix and match to kind of cover each other's weaknesses a little bit. Guns deal with flyers much better. Huntsman can dish out damage at range and do a little bit more to lightly armored armor. Plus, they can shoot over your own lines. The two units synergize pretty well. Guns, of course, much more vulnerable though to enemy counter battery fire. I should mention crossbows are actually pretty good against coast as well, where they can just outrange most of the coast missile lineup and just shoot it down. But yeah, handguns, just a great unit. Good in most matchups as long as you build around them. You just don't want them against elves, really, where at least wood on high elves, because they'll outshoot you pretty badly, and you're going to have a straight up bad time. But most matchups, they can perform some function as long as you protect them. Obviously, people do tend to prefer Outriders, but these guys pour on a lot more damage than Outriders, and they are a little bit cheaper, which does in fact matter sometimes. So I do give them a B tier. I think it's fair. Low B for handguns. Moving on to Huntsman, I think they're actually going to eke out against handguns a little bit. They match handguns against armor up to about 100 on monsters, so they're good against the majority of big armored constructs. Much worse against flyers, of course, due to the slow projectile velocity, but they do have stock. They've got fire on the move, which is excellent when you're repositioning. Great unit against wood elves. Good unit against high elves. Decent unit actually against dark. Honestly, they're decent against all the elves, now that I think about it, really. They're a respectable unit against all the elves. They're a respectable unit against Tomb Kings. They actually have a niche purpose against dwarves, where you can use these guys stock to snipe out enemy artillery crews. If you can debuff enemy armor, they can melt lizardmen, chaos. You can use these guys really in most matchups as long as you build around them. Much like handguns, they can be used in most matchups. Their lack of mobility, though, definitely a bit of a killer. Limits just how many of these guys you can bring compared to, say, Outriders. But I think these guys are definitely a stable B. Not up to snuff with, say, Outriders, who I think are really kingly units, but definitely a very, very solid unit. And maybe even could be a low A. A little bit of handguns for sure. Regiment of Renown Archers. Yeah, Regiment of Renown beneath the C tier. Stock, Snipe, as mentioned, and the Fixingly Forgotten. These sucks on these guys because you got 120 range. Stock can, once again, against dwarves, have a use case that allows you to sneak up and shoot their missile troops, especially artillery, and with the high rate of fire and veterancy, they can shoot pretty quick, melt that crew pretty fast. That veterancy also lets them shoot pretty quick if they're used in a conventional formation. So if you don't want to spend for 2 units of archers, you can just pay for 1, save a little bit of money for some other unit, and get a little bit more DACA. But really not a very good unit at all. Bottom of D tier. Honestly, maybe they shouldn't be bottom of D tier. Maybe I'll put them like above the Amber Wizard, because the Amber Wizard sucks quite a lot too. But they're bottom of D tier. They're not very good at all, and have very few use cases. They're kind of shoehorned in there if you're too cheap to get Huntsman to shoot Dwarven artillery. Sterling's Revenge, an all-right unit, though I don't think they're quite up to par. Well, they're comparable to Free Company, just in a very different manner. So I'm going to put them around somewhat bottom C tier. AP Free Company Militia with immunity psychology and stock. Cool against dwarves, where if you're sneaky and maneuver correctly, they can dish out some quick hurt. Decent as a point defense against lizardmen. Decent as a point defense against chaos. In sort of a last-ditch effort, they can fight okay in melee, and they can just overwhelm a target with DACA. Tomb Kings, very vulnerable to these guys, especially now that they fire on the move. 90 models of massive AP damage is terrifying for any faction to face off if they get caught by these guys. Once again, let down a bit by short range, let down by high cost, let down by the fact that Empire doesn't defend backlines that well, but a very, very solid unit that can be used against most shorter ranged factions pretty effectively. Wouldn't recommend them against Beastmen or Dark Elves, probably, because I think they're just too expensive in those two matchups. But against more rush-oriented factions that don't have the missile pressure, I think these guys are really, really solid. Silver Bullets, another very high-ranking unit. Whether to put them at A or S is a bit debatable. I actually think I'll put them at S tier. You know what? I'm not putting the mage at S tier. Screw that. It's not that good of a mage. It's just that you have to because it's the only mage. But Silver Bullets. What's so good about them? Well, if you're going to bring a single missile on foot, it's probably these guys. They have stock, they have AP, they have magic damage. The only matchup where they're not very good is Dwarves because they do magic damage. And the stock doesn't quite offset that. If your opponent has a Rune Lord on a toilet seat, they do 40% less damage, which is terrible. But a little bit of extra range over handguns. Fire faster, of course, have better accuracy. Just an excellent sniper and ambush unit. Not too much more expensive than normal handguns. Can mulch a lot of elite cavalry. If they get a jump on Dragon Princes, if they get the jump on Phoenix Guard, if they get the jump on Grail Knights, any physical resistant unit, they'll do well. If your opponent tries to drop Shield of Thorns, screw that. These guys will burn through it in no time. So an easy S tier for this unit. Synergizes well with Huntsman. You can even bring in its Wood Elves because they'll tear through trees and they'll tear through the Regiment Renown, Wild Riders, and Orion, and all those characters very, very effectively. So easy S tier for these guys. Just such a good unit. And their brethren, the Huntsman, yeah, like the exact opposite. Another F tier unit. I think they're actually even worse than the Tattersouls, probably, because there's literally no point in these guys. They're Huntsmen that fight okay in melee. Paying an extra 250 for melee stats that you don't really want to be using in the first place is just a waste. You're better off paying for spears to protect your Huntsman. So, yeah. They're just too expensive of a missile unit. Not enough of an upgrade over normal Huntsman to justify them in really any Empire build. Empire doesn't really do Vanguard builds. If you do any Vanguarding, it's with Skirmish Cav. Or maybe Zintler's Reichsguard. These guys ain't it, Chief. They can be used for the memes, I guess, but really, you're better off bringing Huntsmen and Spears. Or Huntsmen and paying for a Foe Seeker again. Moving on to Pistoliers, and I'm sure certain Empire players will be most displeased that I'm not putting them super high on the list, but I'm going to give them a respectable B tier. Pistoliers, lack of range, lack of AP, is definitely a little bit of a killer. Lack of any melee stats and low HP just makes them super vulnerable. They get outskirmished by quite a lot, but they dish out massive amounts of hurt, which is amazing. They're very quick on their feet, the only fast Empire skirmish cav, because Outriders sit at 84 speed. These guys are actually at 90. So actually mobile. Decent counter skirmishers against shorter range skirmish factions. Have a super combo with Gelt. Hit a monster that's got like 120 or so armor, drop it down to health, and Pistoliers turn it to mulch in no time because their damage output is just insane. But really bad AP values. If you need to deal with, say, armored infantry, you're much better off with grenade launchers. If you need to deal with armored cavalry, you're better off with Outriders or grenade launchers or anything else. So they land themselves a B tier, but very respectable. They're very good at clearing out lightly armored large or de-armored large, or skirmishers and that sort of thing. Outriders, easy A tier in my book. Excellent skirmisher unit, lots of range DPS, not quite up to par with handguns for raw damage output at long range. But basically they're a handgun unit on a horse. They can move and reposition quickly, dish out decent burst damage, and keep firing while repositioning. 130 range lets them outrange most most enemy skirmish play, except a handful of archer units. You just don't want to get caught in melee because they'll get wrecked. They're basically a pure handgun unit. But yeah, they can reposition, outrun infantry especially. Outrun heavy cav, though you certainly don't want to get caught by light cav. Light cav will run these guys down. Don't fight skirmish cav in melee, but they will mow everything down kind of low DPS overall, because they or low damage output overall, because their max ammo isn't that high. But an excellent unit, easy A tier. Just so easy to defend handguns, basically, is what these guys are. Even though their overall damage is much lower, and so they get an A. Grenade launchers, another unit that gets A. Maybe I should move these guys under spears. They are definitely a little bit of a niche case with certain spears. Spears should probably be top of A tier when I think about it, because they're a unit you use a lot. Maybe not. I'll keep them down here. It's okay. Outrider grenades, mulch infantry for days, mulch skirmish cavalry for days. They're an incredible bully unit against factions that don't have good range. They can just decide the matchup against a faction like Dark Elves. A single unit of these guys will wreck the whole Dark Elf infantry corps if you can keep them alive. Against Norscout, they'll wreck all of their cavalry or all of their infantry. They'll wreck lightly armored cav, skirmish cav especially. They'll take half the HP off unit Marauder Horsemen. Brutal, disgusting unit for raw range DPS. Very vulnerable to counter skirmish. Very vulnerable to cavalry, especially light cav. Artillery, of course, will mow them down. Not very safe at all. But if you can micro them and you get one of those strong matchups against shorter range enemies, Greenskins, Dark Elves, kind of Beastmen, though that's one that's tough to manage just because of how fast Beastmen can be. Dwarves on a hilly map, because of the compact formations, these guys can do excellent. If you can get the jump on Skaven, they'll do rather well. They'll mulch their infantry. Just a very, very strong unit. Easy A tier for Outriders. Even though they're not great in all matchups, they're great in a lot of matchups. And when they're great, they really, really are great. They can hard carry a game by annihilating your opponent's infantry corps. There's no infantry unit these guys won't wipe efficiently, given the time. Against undead, they can clear out the zombie summons, which is great. Stuff like that. Moving on to the War Wagon, and I'm sure some people will be a bit surprised to see that this is not a pure meme pick. I'm putting it down at C tier because I don't think it's a great pick. Definitely Outriders with their raw DPS are better usually. Or Handguns are better because they just dish out more hurt fast. But Outriders are but War Wagons are very survivable. They're very mobile, or relatively mobile. They can keep firing when engaged in melee. They just don't need that much protection, and they can actually do a respectable amount of damage given the time now. So they are going to get themselves a C tier. I think they're actually better than all of these infantry down here. They can just dish out that hurt given the time to do so. Against Bretonnia, they can be solid. They can be solid against High Elves because High Elves can't kill them quick. They can be okay against Lizardmen. Factions like that, they'll just do attrition damage over time. Mortars, another excellent unit in my opinion. The Mortar Wagons. In my opinion, they're actually probably a low B. I really like these guys. Where Outrider grenades fail because of their short range, these guys can shine. High Elves, Wood Elves, mow them down at long range. Chip away with a Mortar Barrage. Tomb Kings, you can do some work as long as you can protect yourself against Bone Giants. So that is a bit of an iffy choice there. But especially if it's a hillier map, these guys can do work against Tomb Kings. Obviously, there's not too many factions where you really want these guys over grenade launchers because the amount of long-range factions isn't that high. But against long-range factions, Mortar Wagon, Hells, yeah, especially High Elves will just do work. You can do work against Greenskins, chip them down over time, and it's safer. Bretonnia, this is, in my opinion, the Kingmaker unit in the Bretonnia matchup because you can kill off pox arrows and slowly kite away, outpacing the enemy infantry, so that denying them the cav engagement where they just drag you into the muck with pox spam. So, excellent unit. Easy B tier for them. And honestly, in certain matchups, it could probably be A or even S tier just because of how important it is against the Bretonnia. I think this unit single-handedly makes the Bretonnia matchup manageable right now. Black Lions, another solid unit, and I think another B tier, though not for the same reasons as the Mortar Wagon. If you can pick off key targets, these guys are excellent. If you've got some more expensive targets, some more elite cav, single entities like characters on foot, or big monsters, this will mulch them very, very fast. Net a target down. Goodbye. 960 damage per 10 seconds per gun turns them to mush. However, incredibly expensive unit, very fragile unit for how expensive it is. Kind of like a Luminarc. Very low ammo. So much like the Luminarc, once again, if you do not get that critical value, if your opponent just brought too much chaff for you, then this unit will not net its money's worth. and it becomes a problem. But it can be good against factions such as Lizardmen. It can be good against factions such as Dwarves if you can pick off their artillery. It can be good against a faction like Wood Elves if you can protect it against Aerocurnus. High Elves, you can chip them down. Bretonnia, you can kill off their cavalry over time. 100% has its usages. It just takes a lot of micro, a lot of skill. And kind of a niche unit just because of how expensive and fragile it is, but very, very solid when it's used correctly. Knights are another unit that for me wavers on S tier. I'm going to drop them. No, they're going to be an S tier because there's almost never a case. The only case I can really think of, they're a low S, but they're a unit that you won't run against, say, Dwarves, I think. I know some people do, but I don't think they're a great unit against Dwarves. Not necessarily the greatest unit against Coast. Sometimes you just want Knights of the Blazing Sun, but if you need a filler, much like the Spears, if you need a filler heavy cav as Empire, you're going to bring Knights. 110 armor, they can ignore cheap Spears. They are a great body blocking tool. Basically isn't a matchup where you don't want a Knight or two. Even if you're going for man spam, you want some Knights just to block up enemy monsters. If you're going for a more narrow Demi-Griffin oriented build, these guys provide you with additional mass and additional bodies just to soak enemy charges. They can help clear up backlines, clear off zombie summons or carrion or bats trying to disrupt artillery crews, whatever the case may be. Excellent unit, easy S tier. Not the punchiest unit, not the best heavy cav in the game by any stretch, but a very, very strong unit and one that consistently shows up in Empire builds, basically everywhere. Their brethren in the Reichsguard, though far more glamorous in appearance, are not so glamorous in performance or use. I shouldn't say performance. Their performance is all right, but they just don't get outshone by Knights of the Blazing Sun and Empire Knights. For me, Reichsguard are one of those other low C tier units. They've got a specific usage against High Elves because Knights of the Blazing Sun get crushed by Dragon Princes so badly. And so Reichsguard not having fire damage helps them there. They can be an okay barrier unit if your Knights just don't feel strong enough in a matchup. Then Reichsguard will fight better. They can be a supplement, but sadly, just I don't. The majority of matchups, if you've got decent micro, Knights of the Blazing Sun are going to be your bread and butter for punchy mid-tier cav. And if you just want cheap disruption or backline defense, then Knights are a better way to go. They're 300 cheaper. You can get Spears and Knights for the cost of a unit of Reichsguard, basically. So. Unfortunately, these guys just do not net themselves that much value. Knights of the Blazing Sun, an excellent unit in my opinion. Probably low A, or I'm going to give them a low A, but faster than Reichsguard, punchier than Reichsguard, much more fragile than Reichsguard, but they've got magic resist, so they shrug off Spirit Leech, so they can't kill them, kill models instantly, and which is actually pretty important. And they synergize super well with Gelt and his armor sundering. In matchups where they don't fight the heaviest armor, they're brutal. Wood Elves, they're an excellent unit. As mentioned before, not great against High Elves. If you're going for man spam, you obviously don't want Knights of the Blazing Sun, you just want Knights. Decent against Tomb Kings because fire damage. If you've got any armor sundering, they'll do well against Greenskins. They'll do well against Lizardmen, Dark Elves. We already mentioned Wood Elves. Once again, not Dwarves. I wouldn't bother with these guys against Dwarves. They can be okay against Coast as a last-ditch sort of unit to counter Morngulls with. Because they do punch a bit harder than Knights do. They'll actually beat these units up, which Knights won't necessarily. And they clear zombies a little more efficiently. Good against Skaven. The magic resist helps a lot against Skaven, who tend to throw around a lot of magic damage in that matchup. Just a very, very strong unit overall. And I think an easy A tier for them, though not quite up to snuff with Knights. Might actually be a bit better than Outriders, both Outrider models. Might actually push them up a bit there. Demi-Griff Knights, long the spurned ugly duckling of the Empire roster, alongside perhaps Reichsguard. But a decent unit in my opinion. Actually rather respectable nowadays. And I'm probably going to annoy some people here. I'm actually going to put them up to B tier. In my opinion, they're about as good as Demi-Griff Knights with Halberds right now. I probably rate them... they're pretty similar to a Mortar Wagon in my opinion for validity. Maybe a little... I'll give them a little bit more. But if you're expecting armor and not expecting single entities, these guys are a good choice. They're very beefy. They're beefier than Demi-Griff Halberds. They're much more tanky against missiles. Obviously quicker than any horse-mounted cavalry Empire has. or horsemen out of heavy cav, I should say. They cause fear. They've got slightly better leadership, excellent armor. Just a very, very strong unit overall. Demigryph Knights are great against, in my opinion, dwarves. Or not, sorry, not dwarves. They can have a niche use against dwarves. You build a very specific sort of artillery-centric build, but they can be okay against dwarves. But really, they're good against greenskins, in my opinion. They're good against high elves. They're respectable against chaos. They actually can be okay against Bretonnia if you build around it. Obviously, Demigryph Halberds kind of tend to be more popular there in Bretonnia and Vampire Counts especially, but Demigryphs with lances are not bad. They're actually not bad against Lizardmen. It might seem weird with all the monsters, but they do about comparable against cavalry to Demigryph Halberds. And they're more effective against infantry, like way more effective. So being able to cleave through Saurus or Cycle Charge Temple Guard, kind of valuable. And a reason why these guys are going to land in B tier. And their brethren, Halberds, are actually going to land the same spot. And some of you guys might be like, what the heck? Aren't these guys like the meta? No. In my opinion, Demigryph Halberds are probably the most overrated unit on the Empire roster. People treat them as if they're the meta dominant pick for Empire, and if you got to build around these guys. No. There's a handful of demi-blobs, and the demi-blobs are split between different Demigryph variants nowadays. Against Vampire Counts, against High Elves, but mixed in with normal Demigryphs, against, to an extent, greenskins, depending on what build you want, but it's very much a niche thing, and either or Demigryph can work. But really, it's the heavy cav faction, specifically Bretonnia and Vampire Counts, is where the Demigryph Halberds shine. That is where they excel. And against Bretonnia, you have to be careful to remove pox arrows ahead of time, or you are screwed. Chaos is the third faction where I think they're a decent choice, just because they can tear down Kolek or Shaggoth pretty effectively. But against Lizards, not really that good, because they tend to get skirmished down. Same thing as Tomb Kings, where there's some monsters occasionally. They tend to suffer losses. High Elves, they tend to bleed. Dark Elves, they tend to bleed to Cold One Knights. So ultimately, not that good of a unit. They obviously have very strong potential in specific matchups, Vampire Counts especially. But overall, I think they're a very niche unit. And I kind of talked up these other units, but everyone knows where Demigryph Knights are strong, but I think they've got this mythic reputation, probably going back to Warhammer 1. And they aren't really that good. They're a solid unit, respectable unit, great in specific matchups, specific instances, but ultimately about the same as a normal Demigryph Knight, and a stable B tier. Zintler's Reichsguard, basically Reichsguard souped up, and definitely better than vanilla Reichsguard. I'm gonna put them mid C tier. Just the fact they have Vanguard and have immune psychology makes them they're kind of like a Dragon Prince with no physical resist, and instead you get permanent martial mastery almost. They're kind of like a Dragon Prince, and they call similar with Vanguard. And immune psychology. So a neat unit overall. Not amazing, but Empire Cavalry doesn't have the best leadership, so these guys can stick around, especially if there's some leadership bombing shenanigans like for Wood Elves. And overall, Zintler's Reichsguard definitely a solid or respectable unit. It gets itself to a mid C tier. Yeah, they're not a huge amount better than Reichsguard, but I think C is more than fair. Finally, for the Cav, we do have the Royal Graphites, and these guys are really excellent Cav. Compared to normal Demigryph Halberds, I think they're actually going to net themselves an A tier. If you're going to run Demi-Halbs, you're going to run these guys. The fact that they give you terror without needing to bring a terror-causing Lord or a Steam Tank is definitely nice, because Empire kind of struggles to bring terror to the field otherwise. Their combat stats, well, they're rank 9 Demigryphs with Halberd, so they're not amazing, but they're decent. And of course, having terror plus rank 9 stats makes these guys very resilient to routing. One of the big problems for Demigryph Knights is that they tend to rout rather easily. They don't have the highest leadership values. They do cause fear, but they don't cause terror, so they are susceptible to terror routes. Especially if they get surrounded, they can get dragged down and routed pretty quickly, especially if you don't have Benediction or something nearby. But Royal Graphites, even without that support, will hold rather well. They'll really beat the crap out of any cavalry in the game. They're one of the best anti-large units in the game. I think the only unit that beats them 1v1, off the top of my head, is the Regiment of Renowned Questing Knights, the Companions of Canel, who are kind of insane. But These guys easily knit themselves an A tier. And really, really solid unit. Oftentimes, if you're going to bring one demigriff unit, it's going to be these guys, just for the terror, just for the sturdiness and stability that they provide. Moving on to artillery, first and foremost is the Mortar, and this is a unit that I know some people really like. I am personally not a fan of it. I'm going to give it a D tier, actually. And that's because I don't think the Mortar is very good. It is cheap, but Empire does not do a great job defending its backlines against most factions. Maybe Wood Elves are kind of an exception. And because it's static, unlike the Mortar Wagon, it is susceptible to those pushes, to those rushes. And obviously against any more heavily armored faction, it kind of falls flat. You really want it to pressure archers. So maybe it's either a high D or a low C. I'm going to give it a high D because it can work against Wood Elves. It can work all right against High Elves, just to pressure archers while being fairly cheap, so you don't care if you lose it too much. It can work against Bretonnia if your opponent's kind of slow and doesn't push very aggressively. But I find, in my experience, it's better to slow kite with a Mortar Wagon than to actually try and stand your ground with a normal mortar. And so I'm going to give it a high D. Sometimes you just want to go cheap and not pay for a full-blown Mortar Wagon, but there's not too many matchups, in my opinion, where a Mortar deserves really to be brought over Mortar Wagon. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with me, but I find that the flimsiness and immobility of the Mortar is just such a killer and really hinders. I should say maybe a low C. It can work against Tomb Kings, I guess, as well. It's good at butchering skeletons, but really not a great unit. Great Cannon, respectable unit, gets itself a low B. Obviously a decent anti-artillery piece. Doesn't win cost effectively against Bretonnian trebuchets. At least in my testing, I know this is contested. I know some people have had other experiences. It does barely eke out the win against Bretonnian trebs. It does beat bolt throwers pretty consistently, both high elf and dark elf ones and dwarf ones. But not a great unit against sort of top tier anti-artillery units. Definitely not the greatest anti-artillery piece. Its rate of fire is actually fake news. It doesn't actually fire as fast as it's supposed to, which hurts it quite a bit. It doesn't lay as much damage out against cavalry. And of course, being an Empire crew, it's much easier to rout off, much easier to run down. As a result, the poor cannon does get itself a low B. Maybe it should even just be a high C because, well, it does have the Hammer of Witches competing against it. And usually you're not going for a super artillery heavy build with multiple cannons as Empire. So I think high C is probably fair. Sometimes you just want one cannon to apply long range pressure, and that's okay. But most of the time you scrape up the money for a hammer because it's just so much better. The one exception actually might be against Bretonnia, where the Hammer of the Witch's magic damage is just a straight downgrade against the Fey Enchantress, as well as Lewin to an extent. So, a bit of debatable there, but most matchups I do think the vanilla cannon's not that strong. Hellblaster Volley Gun, definitely a bit of a niche unit. Can be hilarious if you bring a lot of them. If you attain a certain critical mass, this unit will mulch infantry. I'm actually going to put it a little bit above the Mortar, but I do still think it's a niche use unit. Against Wood Elves, it can do amazing work. You bring 2-3 of these guys, they will mulch them. Against High Elves, if you can win the artillery war, these guys are pretty strong. Same with Dark Elves. Just Elves in general, these guys will turn them to mincemeat. If you can protect Hellblasters, they do work. So against factions that don't have enough range power to crush them, yeah, Hellblasters will live up to their namesake and wreck face. Insane damage output per gun. Solid precision. Not as good against infantry as you'd expect from what's essentially a machine gun or a Gatling gun, or appears to be like a Gatling gun almost. I guess it's kind of like an organ gun more so, more volley gun, but still. Not as good as against infantry as you'd expect, but really can wreck any target given the opportunity, and is just a very expensive unit and a unit that's kind of hard for Empire to defend. But in the handful of matchups, like against Lizardmen, against High Elves, against Wood Elves, it can be a fun unit that really, really dishes out the pain. Hellstorm Rocket Battery, definitely not as strong. I'm going to give it a high D tier. Against Dwarves, there are certain builds where you can make this unit work okay. Against High Elves, it can apply some long-range pressure. Against Bretonnians, it can apply some long-range pressure, though you usually don't want to be static against Bretonnians. Most of the time, though, as Empire, you're going to be getting rushed down, and this unit doesn't really lay down the pain. It's very bad on hilly maps. Its rockets tend to smack the ground. Very imprecise, and doesn't do its damage in that big of a burst, unlike its Regiment Renown version, which, in my opinion, just makes the Hellstorm kind of not that good. I think it's a D tier. It has its niche applications. If you're too cheap to pay for a Sunmaker and you want that whopping 480 range, then yeah, it can work. It can really apply pressure past the range of anything your opponent can put on the field. But is it worth it? Most of the time not. Most of the time you're better off just coughing up the money for the Sunmaker or not bothering with rockets at all and bring a different artillery piece, if any. Luminarc or Miminarc, gonna get itself an F tier. At the moment, it's even bugged as far as I've experienced and as far as I've heard, where it easily gets disrupted from firing, which is kind of a disaster. It doesn't just keep firing even if it's moving, which, while trollish, also made it more reliable back in the day. Now it doesn't even do that. And usually, if you're going to bring a Luminarc, you're going to bring the Templeoff Luminarc, which is just much more, which at least has a net and only costs a tiny bit more, has a little bit more precision. So Luminarc is basically a pure meme unit. Funny if it works, but really, if you're going to bring a Luminarc, it's going to be the Templeoff Luminarc, and the Templeoff Luminarc's a meme in and of itself. Steam Tank, also known as the Meme Tank, and another unit that is none too hot. I'm going to give it the same tier as the Hellblaster and the Mortar. I probably a little bit worse than the Mortar. Around the same tier. I'm not a huge fan of the Mortar, as you guys can tell. But I'm going to put it between the Hellblaster and the Mortar. It can have niche applications against Greenskins, I say Beastmen. Beastmen, it's a trap unit, in my opinion, unless you're blobbing super hard. But Greenskins, High Elves especially, this unit can do some hurt. Against Dwarves, if you're able to pick apart their artillery, this unit can then work as a sort of win condition, shoot them down over time, run them over, that sort of thing. But it's mostly against High Elves. Kind of Bretonnia, I should mention. It can chip away at Knights and then hold its own in melee, rout off Peasants. But and it works okay with a Slow Kite because you can pick off the Peasant Archers with Mortars and then use the Steam Tank's cannon to knock out Knights. But definitely a very niche unit. And one that I wouldn't recommend for most compositions. It can just be kind of fun to use occasionally. Hammer of Witches, a respectable cannon, and one that I'm going to give a low A tier. If you're going to bring any artillery as Empire, odds are it's the Hammer of Witches. Probably sees more play than all other Empire artillery combined. Excellent counter battery piece. I believe the best in the game, actually, because it has physical resistance. It does more damage per shot than any other artillery piece. It does, I believe, 450, while cannons do, or is it 5? It might actually be 550 damage per shot, while most cannons only do 450-ish. It can snipe off enemy artillery models really, really efficiently. It can shrug off enemy return fire fairly well, and it's fairly precise, being Regiment Renown. Plus magic damage, which bypasses physical resist on certain targets, especially like a Tree Man, or Malekith, or certain lords and heroes who rely on physical resist. This ignores it. Very solid there. Just a good unit overall. That's itself an easy low A, in my opinion, because if there's a defining Empire artillery piece, it is the Hammer. Sunmaker, yeah, another bit of a meme. I'm going to give it a very low C. It's definitely better than the Hellstorm. It can saturate an area very, very quickly. It fires 9 rockets. It basically fires 3 times as fast as the Hellstorm because it fires 9 rockets at a time instead of 3. It can annihilate an area very, very quick. Rack up the kill count. And it'll look super impressive, except it runs out of ammo super, super quickly. And it costs you an arm and a leg. It's an 1800 gold unit, so to make its money back, it really needs to be shooting some elite infantry. Can be solid against High Elves because it can mulch Sisters of Averlorn. It can be decent against Wood Elves because it mulches Waywatchers. It can actually counter battery fire pretty well, so if you've got enemy artillery, just pick off. Boom, here you go. You got the raw power of a Hailstorm rocket battery. It'll crush Bretonnian trebuchets. It'll crush Skaven. It'll crush Skaven artillery pieces, that sort of thing. It is a very powerful counter battery piece, but very expensive and very difficult to make it pay for itself. So Kind of a problem for it. Kind of a reason why it doesn't get higher on this list. If it costs like 200 less gold, I actually think it would probably spike up to an easy A tier, but at 1800 it's just too expensive to justify, even though it reliably dishes all its damage out. Finally, the Temple off Luminarc, which kind of a sad unit to end it on, I guess, but it is one I had. That's how I had things organized. I'm gonna give it a D tier. It's another kind of meme unit. I'm gonna give it. Yeah. I'm gonna put it above the Huntsman. It's a similar level meme to the Huntsman General. It's got its one gimmick: snipe enemy characters and lords. If it fails, you're screwed, and you've probably lost the game because you're 2,000 gold in the hole. If it works well, then your opponent might have just lost the game in a single shot, which is kind of funny for you, probably not for them. And you have a net on this unit, which can either protect you or help you set up that kill shot. So, fun unit in a way. Definitely gimmicky, single use, and doesn't have much else going for it, but it can be good fun. And so I'm going to give it a sort of mid-low D tier, because you can get some value out of it occasionally. I just wouldn't recommend bringing it most of the time. But that is it for the Empire tier list. As mentioned before, feel free to share your own thoughts and opinions, guys. I know this was a long video. I'll be trying to keep the other ones a bit shorter, but there's a lot to explain, and this doubles as a bit of an explanation for where each unit lies in the Empire roster and what function they serve. So hopefully it gives you guys some ideas. As always, share your own thoughts and opinions down below. Feel free to let me know what you think. If you think I overrate or underrate some units, I'd love to hear it. I always do appreciate the feedback, but hopefully you guys did enjoy, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.